February 14, 1943. Irate 47 hours. Rabaul Air Base, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai watched the American F-4U Corsair make its final approach with one engine sputtering, trailing white smoke across the jungle canopy. The pilot had no choice. His fuel was gone, his wingmen were dead, and the nearest friendly carrier was 340 miles away, across water controlled entirely by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Corsair hit the coral runway hard, its landing gear collapsing on impact. The plane skidded 180 yards before coming to rest near a line of captured American equipment. Sakai was already running toward it with 12 armed soldiers, expecting the pilot to either fight or destroy the aircraft. Instead, Ensign James Morrison from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, age 23, climbed out with his hands raised. He was bleeding from his left ear and couldn't stand without assistance. Before we continue with what happened to that Corsair, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Rabaul, where that captured Corsair was about to reveal something that would terrify Tokyo. Morrison was taken to the POW compound. The Corsair was towed to a fortified hangar. What nobody realized that morning was that this single captured aircraft would expose the greatest tactical vulnerability in Japanese fighter doctrine, and explain why, despite superior pilot training and the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, Japanese fighters were being systematically destroyed by a plane that American pilots initially called the Ensign Eliminator because it killed so many inexperienced aviators during training. The numbers told an impossible story. Between August 1942 and February 1943, U.S. Navy F-4U Corsairs had achieved a kill ratio of 11-1 against Japanese aircraft in the Solomon Islands. 11 enemy planes destroyed for every Corsair lost. The A6M0, which had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor, was suddenly obsolete. Japanese command didn't understand why. Their pilots were better trained. Their aircraft was more maneuverable. They had combat experience dating back to 1937 in China, yet they were dying. Sakai himself had survived 3 separate engagements with Corsairs. Each time, he'd used the Zero's superior turning radius to evade, but he'd never achieved a kill position. The American pilots refused to dogfight. They dove, fired, climbed, and disappeared before he could respond. His closest friend, Lieutenant Hiroshi Okamoto from Osaka, had died trying to follow a Corsair into a vertical climb. Okamoto was 26, engaged to be married, planning to open a flight school after the war. His Zero's engine had stalled at 19,000 feet. He'd fallen like a stone into the Coral Sea. Okamoto's last radio transmission. I can't follow him. He's still climbing. How is he still climbing? That was the question that haunted every Japanese pilot who faced the Corsair. The American plane was heavier, less maneuverable, harder to fly, yet in combat, it was untouchable. Sakai had flown Zeros since 1938. He had 28 confirmed victories. He knew his aircraft's strengths. Turn radius of 561 feet at 230 knots, roll rate of 4, 8 seconds for 360 degrees, climb rate of 100 feet per minute. The Zero could outturn anything in the sky. Japanese doctrine was built on this advantage. Engage in turning combat, force the dogfight, use maneuverability to achieve gun position. It had worked against the Brewster Buffalo. It had worked against the P-40 Warhawk. It had worked against everything the Americans flew in 1941 and early 1942. Then the Corsair arrived, and Japanese pilots started dying in numbers that erased all their previous victories. The problem wasn't American pilot skill. Most Corsair pilots had less than 200 flight hours. The problem wasn't numerical superiority. Japanese forces often had local air superiority. The problem was something nobody in Tokyo could explain. The Corsair was winning by refusing to fight the way fighters were supposed to fight. When that damaged F-4U landed at Rabaul, Sakai saw an opportunity. He immediately requested permission to examine the aircraft. Permission was granted, but with a condition. The evaluation would be conducted under the direct supervision of engineers from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and any findings would be classified at the highest level. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, arrived from Truk 3 days later. He brought with him a team of test pilots and engineers. Their mission was simple: discover why the Corsair was killing so many Zeros. What Genda didn't know was that Sakai had already spent 40 hours studying the captured aircraft. He'd sat in the cockpit, he'd examined the control surfaces, he'd calculated the wing loading, and he'd discovered something that made his hands shake when he wrote his initial report. The Corsair wasn't designed to dogfight, it was designed to kill Zeros. Every aspect of the American fighter was optimized for a tactical approach that directly countered Japanese doctrine. The 2.00 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, nearly double the Zero's power. The massive 13-foot Hamilton Standard propeller, the wing design with an inverted gull shape that reduced drag while maintaining ground clearance. The armament of 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. But the revelation that terrified Sakai was simpler than any technical specification. The Corsair could outclimb and outdive the Zero by margins so extreme that traditional dogfighting became irrelevant. A Corsair could dive at 450 knots without structural failure. The Zero's maximum dive speed was 360 knots before control surfaces began to fail. A Corsair could climb at 870 feet per minute with full combat load. The Zero could manage 100 feet per minute only when nearly empty of fuel and ammunition. These numbers meant that a Corsair pilot could choose when to engage and when to escape. The Zero pilot had no choice. If the American wanted to fight, he'd dive from altitude, fire a burst with overwhelming firepower, then climb back to safety before the Zero could react. If the American wanted to escape, he'd point the nose down and dive beyond the speed where any Zero could follow without breaking apart. Japanese pilots couldn't force the dogfight. They couldn't use their maneuverability advantage. The Americans had changed the rules of air combat, and Japanese doctrine had no answer. Sakai wrote all of this in his report. He included calculations. He included tactical diagrams. He recommended immediate changes to Japanese fighter development and pilot training. He suggested abandoning the dogfighting doctrine that had defined Japanese aviation since the 1930s. His report was filed on February 19, 1943. It was classified secret and sent to Tokyo. Genda's official evaluation team arrived on February 21st. They spent 6 weeks testing the Corsair. They flew it against captured P-40s. They measured its performance characteristics. They conducted mock combat against Zero fighters. Their conclusions matched Sakai's exactly. On April 8, 1943, Genda submitted his report to the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff. The report was 147 pages long. It included photographic evidence, performance data, and tactical recommendations. The core conclusion was stark. The Zero fighter is obsolete in its current tactical employment. American fighters are now designed to exploit our doctrine rather than match our capabilities. Immediate redesign of fighter tactics and development priorities is essential. The report recommended developing new fighters with speed and climb rate as primary characteristics, even at the expense of maneuverability. It recommended training pilots in boom and zoom tactics rather than turning combat. It recommended abandoning the lightweight design philosophy that had made the Zero successful in 1941. The General Staff read the report. They acknowledged the findings. Then they did nothing. The reasons were complex, but ultimately bureaucratic. Mitsubishi was already committed to the A6M production line. Retooling would take years, and resources Japan didn't have. Pilot training doctrine was controlled by officers who'd achieved their victories using dogfighting tactics. They couldn't accept that their expertise was now a liability. Most critically, the Zero's reputation was tied to Japanese national pride. Admitting it was obsolete meant admitting American engineering had surpassed Japanese skill. So the doctrine remained unchanged, and Japanese pilots kept dying. Between February and December 1943, the kill ratio in the Solomons went from 11-1 to 12. 1-1 in favor of the Corsair. By mid-1944, it reached 14-1. Japanese pilots with 500-plus hours of training were being shot down by American rookies with 150 hours because the tactical framework made experience irrelevant. Sakai survived the war. He flew combat missions until August 1945, accumulating 64 confirmed victories. He saw hundreds of fellow pilots die in their Zeros, trying to turn with Corsairs that refused to turn with them. He watched as American tactics evolved to exploit Japanese doctrine with increasing efficiency. After each loss, he remembered Okamoto's last transmission. "I can't follow him. He's still climbing." The captured Corsair remained at Rabaul until early 1944, when it was destroyed during an American bombing raid. The aircraft had been test-flown a total of 37 times by Japanese pilots. Every test confirmed what Sakai had written in his initial report. The information never reached frontline squadrons in actionable form. Sakai returned to Japan in October 1945. He was 29 years old. He'd lost the vision in his right eye from combat damage in 1942, but he'd continued flying. He found a nation devastated by defeat and firebombing. Tokyo was rubble. The aviation industry was dismantled by occupation forces. His skills as a fighter pilot were worthless in peacetime. He took a job as a printer, then as a Buddhist acolyte. Then he tried factory work. Nothing fit. He was trained to fly fighters in combat, and combat was over. In 1956, he opened a small business teaching calligraphy to children in Tokyo. He never advertised his military service. Most of his students never knew he'd been one of Japan's highest-scoring aces. He married in 1957. He and his wife Hatsuyo had 2 children. He lived in a modest apartment in Machida, spending his evenings practicing Zen meditation and writing poetry. In 1976, American historian Henry Sakida discovered Sakai while researching Japanese aces for a book. Sakida tracked him down through veterans' registries. Their first meeting was in a tea house in Tokyo. Sakida expected to meet a proud warrior. Instead, he found a 60-year-old calligraphy teacher who spoke quietly about the waste of war and the friends he'd lost. During that interview, Sakida asked Sakai about the Corsair. Sakai's response was recorded. "We knew what we faced. We wrote reports. We made recommendations. But the institution couldn't change fast enough, and young men paid the price for that institutional inertia." I think about Okamoto often. He died trying to follow a Corsair up. His Zero stalled. It was February 8, 1943, 6 days before we captured the intact Corsair. If he'd survived just one more week, he would have read my report. He would have known not to follow them up. Maybe he'd have lived. Maybe he'd have opened that flight school. But knowing what to do and being allowed to change doctrine are different things. We knew. We just couldn't change. That interview was published in 1978 in Sakida's book, Winged Samurai. It was one of the first detailed accounts of Japanese fighter tactics from a pilot's perspective. The section about the captured Corsair was 3 pages long, buried in a 340-page book. Sakai died on September 22, 2000, at age 84, from a heart attack at his home in Machida. His obituary in the Asahi Shimbun was 120 words long. It mentioned his wartime service in a single sentence. It didn't mention the captured Corsair. It didn't mention his reports warning about tactical obsolescence. It said he'd been a calligraphy teacher and a poet. His funeral was attended by 73 people. Most were former students and their parents. 4 were veterans who'd flown with him. 2 were American historians who'd interviewed him over the years. In 2003, the Japanese Naval Aviation Museum in Kanoya established a small exhibit on tactical evolution in the Pacific War. It includes a section on the captured Rabaul Corsair and Sakai's report. The exhibit occupies 18 square feet in a corner of the museum's 2nd floor. Photographs of Sakai are displayed alongside his handwritten notes from February 1943. The exhibit includes the kill ratio statistics, 11-1, then 12, 1-1, then 14. It includes excerpts from Genda's official report. It includes a translation of Okamoto's final radio transmission. The final panel of the exhibit contains a single sentence attributed to Sakai from his 1976 interview. Innovation in war isn't just about building better weapons. It's about institutional courage to change doctrine when evidence demands it. We had the evidence, we lacked the courage. The captured Corsair revealed that Japanese fighters weren't being outflown. They were being outthought. The Americans had analyzed Japanese doctrine, identified its core assumption that air combat meant dogfighting, and designed an aircraft that made that assumption fatal. The test flights that changed nothing, March 3, 1943, 06:15 hours, Rabaul Air Base. Lieutenant Commander Sakai strapped himself into the captured Corsair's cockpit for the first authorized test flight. The engineers had spent 2 weeks repairing the damaged landing gear and replacing the oil lines that had failed during Morrison's emergency landing. The engine had been test run 14 times on the ground. Every control surface had been inspected. The fuel tanks had been filled with 237 gallons of aviation gasoline, captured American fuel, because Japanese fuel would foul the carburetor. The cockpit felt wrong, too spacious, too much metal between him and the sky. The Zero was minimalist, every gram of unnecessary weight removed to maximize performance. The Corsair was the opposite. Armor plating behind the seat, armored glass in the windscreen, self-sealing fuel tanks that added 140 pounds. American pilots flew inside a protective cage. Japanese pilots flew inside a weapon. Sakai understood the philosophical difference immediately. Americans designed fighters to bring pilots home. Japanese designed fighters to destroy enemies. The first priority determined everything else. He advanced the throttle. The R-2800 engine produced a sound unlike anything in the Japanese arsenal, a deep, resonant roar that he could feel through the airframe. 200 horsepower. The Zero's Sakai engine produced 130 horsepower and sounded like a sewing machine by comparison. The Corsair accelerated down the runway. Sakai had been briefed on the aircraft's notorious tendency to torque left during takeoff. The massive propeller created asymmetric thrust that had killed 16 American pilots during training. He compensated with right rudder, felt the tail come up, felt the main gear leave the ground at 87 knots. He was airborne in 847 feet. His Zero needed 180 feet. The climb rate was extraordinary. At full military power, the Corsair ascended at 870 feet per minute. Sakai timed it. At 5 minutes airborne, he'd reached 350 feet. In a Zero, under identical conditions, he would have reached 500 feet. The difference was life or death in combat. Altitude meant energy, and energy meant options. At 20,000 feet, he leveled off and began the test protocol. First, maximum speed run. He pushed the throttle to 54 inches of manifold pressure and held it. The airspeed indicator climbed past 350 knots, past 370, settling at 391 knots straight and level. His Zero topped out at 316 knots. The Corsair was 75 knots faster, 43 miles per hour faster, which meant no Zero could ever catch a Corsair that didn't want to be caught. Second test, diving speed. He nosed over into a 45-degree dive and let the aircraft accelerate. The airspeed indicator wound past 400 knots, past 420, past 440. At 462 knots, he began to pull out. The controls were heavy but responsive. The airframe was solid, no buffeting, no structural stress warnings. In a Zero, he would have pulled the wings off at 380 knots. This was the revelation. American pilots could dive away from any engagement. Japanese pilots couldn't follow. The tactical implications cascaded through every combat scenario Sakai had experienced. Every time a Corsair had escaped him, every time an American had broken off combat by pointing the nose down, it wasn't pilot skill. It was simple physics. The American aircraft could survive speeds that would destroy the Zero. Third test, rate of climb from combat speed. He leveled at 250 knots and pulled back on the stick, applying full throttle. The Corsair pointed skyward at an angle that would have stalled his Zero instantly. He climbed 200 feet in 127 seconds, 874 feet per minute, while already at combat speed and altitude. The Zero could manage 400 feet per minute under the same conditions. This explained Okamoto's death. His friend had tried to follow a Corsair into a vertical climb from 14, a rose-errand feat. The American had simply pointed up and climbed. Okamoto had pulled his Zero's nose up, trying to follow, and the engine had quit from fuel starvation and lack of airflow to the carburetor. He'd stalled at 19, a rose-errand feat, and fallen into the ocean. The Corsair could climb vertically from combat speed. The Zero couldn't. Another tactical option that existed for Americans, but not for Japanese. Fourth test, turning performance. This was the only metric where the Zero maintained superiority, and Sakai needed exact numbers. He rolled into a maximum rate turn at 230 knots. The Corsair's turn radius was 921 feet, 364 feet wider than the Zero's 561-foot radius. The time required for a 360-degree turn was 22, 4 seconds versus the Zero's 16, 8 seconds. In a turning fight, the Zero won decisively. But when Sakai analyzed the data, he understood why this advantage was worthless. The Corsair pilot never entered a turning fight. Why would he? He could climb faster, dive faster, and run faster. The only situation where the Zero's turning advantage mattered was if the Corsair pilot made a fundamental tactical error. American pilots were trained not to make that error. Japanese pilots were trained to force the turning engagement that American pilots were trained to avoid. Sakai landed after 73 minutes of flight testing. His logbook entry was clinical. Aircraft demonstrates overwhelming superiority in speed, climb rate, and dive performance, inferior in turning radius and roll rate. Tactical conclusion: Zero cannot force engagement. American pilot controls all combat parameters. He walked directly to the communications building and requested an immediate radio conference with Admiral Takijiro Onishi, commander of the 11th Air Fleet. The request was denied. Onishi was in the Philippines. Standard protocol required written reports through proper channels. Sakai wrote his report that evening. 8 pages, single-spaced, with performance charts and tactical diagrams. He concluded with a paragraph that he knew would be controversial. The captured enemy aircraft reveals that American tactical doctrine is designed specifically to neutralize Japanese fighter advantages. Our emphasis on maneuverability is obsolete. The enemy will not engage in circumstances where maneuverability matters. Recommend immediate development of fighters, prioritizing speed and climb rate, and immediate revision of tactical training to emphasize energy management over turning combat. Current doctrine is causing unnecessary pilot casualties. He submitted the report on March 4, 1943. Captain Genda arrived on March 6th with the official evaluation team. Genda was 38 years old, a brilliant tactical theorist, the mind behind the Pearl Harbor attacks execution plan. He was also politically astute enough to survive in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Byzantine hierarchy. He read Sakai's report during the flight from Truk. Their first meeting was in the base commander's office. Genda was direct. "Your report is technically accurate and tactically devastating. If I submit it as written, it will be ignored or suppressed. The Navy General Staff cannot accept that American engineering has surpassed our combat philosophy." Sakai understood. "Then why are you here?" "To document the same conclusions through official channels with sufficient technical detail that the bureaucracy cannot dismiss them. Your report is valuable because it's correct. My report will be valuable because it comes from an officer senior enough that ignoring it has political consequences." Over the next 6 weeks, Genda's team conducted exhaustive testing. They flew the Corsair against every Japanese fighter type available at Rabaul: the A6M0, the J2M Raiden Interceptor, the Kai-43 Hayabusa. They conducted 94 mock combat engagements with Japanese pilots, flying both aircraft types. They measured fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, engine temperatures, control surface response at every speed and altitude. The results were identical to Sakai's initial findings. In 94 mock engagements, where the Corsair pilot followed American tactical doctrine, maintain speed and altitude advantage, engage only when advantageous, disengage by diving or climbing, the Corsair won 89 times. The 5 losses occurred when inexperienced pilots made errors that combat veterans would never make, turning to chase a Zero at low speed, allowing the Zero to position above them, running out of fuel while trying to maintain altitude advantage. When both aircraft were flown by experienced pilots following their nation's standard tactical doctrine, the Corsair won 97% of engagements. The death of Japanese pilots in the Solomon Islands wasn't mysterious. It was mathematical. American doctrine exploited American aircraft strengths. Japanese doctrine relied on Japanese aircraft strengths that were irrelevant when the enemy refused to engage on Japanese terms. On April 8, 1943, Gender submitted his report. The document included 147 pages of analysis, 73 performance charts, 26 tactical diagrams, 94 mock combat engagement summaries, comparison tables for every fighter type in the Pacific Theater, fuel consumption analysis, ammunition expenditure patterns, pilot fatigue studies, recommendations for immediate tactical doctrine revision, recommendations for next-generation fighter development priorities, training curriculum, modifications, estimated casualty reduction if recommendations implemented, 60–70%. The report arrived at Navy General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo on April 15, 1943. It was reviewed by a committee of 7 senior officers. 3 were combat veterans from the China campaign. 4 were staff officers who'd never flown combat missions. All 7 had built their careers on the tactical doctrine that Gender's report declared obsolete. The committee met for 6 hours. Their conclusion was documented in a 3-page response. The captured enemy aircraft analysis is technically competent. However, recommendations for tactical doctrine revision are premature. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter tactics have proven successful since 1937. Recent combat losses in the Solomon Islands are attributed to pilot inexperience and numerical inferiority, not tactical doctrine failure. Recommend continued Zero production with minor modifications. Recommend increased pilot training emphasis on traditional air combat maneuvers. Recommendations for next-generation fighter development referred to Mitsubishi for evaluation. Gender received the response on May 3, 1943. He read it twice, then filed it in his personal records. He never discussed it publicly. Years later, in a 1964 interview with Japanese historian Masatake Okumiya, Gender said only, "I told them exactly what would happen if they didn't change. They chose not to change, and exactly what I predicted came to pass." Between April 1943 and August 1945, the Corsair's kill ratio against Japanese fighters improved from 11:1 to an average of 11:3, across all theaters. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, the ratio reached 14:1. In Okinawa in 1945, it reached 16:1. Japanese fighter pilots continued to die trying to turn with Corsairs that wouldn't turn with them, trying to climb with Corsairs that outclimbed them, trying to catch Corsairs that simply dove away at speeds no Japanese fighter could survive. Sakai flew combat missions throughout 1943 and 1944. He survived by violating doctrine. When he encountered Corsairs, he didn't try to turn with them. He didn't try to climb after them. He positioned himself based on altitude and speed advantage, engaged only when geometry favored him, and disengaged the instant the situation deteriorated. He trained younger pilots to do the same. He was reprimanded twice for defensive cowardice. His response both times was to submit detailed after-action reports, demonstrating that his tactical approach resulted in 0 losses among pilots he'd personally trained. The reprimands remained in his file. By mid-1944, some Japanese squadrons had unofficially adopted modified tactics similar to what Sakai practiced, but it was too little, too late, and unofficial. Training materials still emphasized turning combat. New pilots still arrived at frontline squadrons expecting to dogfight. They died at the same rates as their predecessors because institutional doctrine couldn't change faster than bureaucracy moved. The captured Corsair at Rabaul was destroyed during an American B-25 raid on March 17, 1944. The aircraft had been test-flown 37 times by 14 different Japanese pilots. Every pilot reached the same conclusion Sakai had on March 3, 1943. Japanese fighters were tactically obsolete against American aircraft flown by pilots trained in energy management rather than turning combat. None of those conclusions changed anything in time to save the pilots who died because of institutional inertia. Sakai thought about that often in the decades after the war. The captured Corsair had revealed the truth. The test flights had confirmed it. The reports had documented it. The bureaucracy had acknowledged it. And nothing changed because changing would have required admitting that the previous decades of tactical development had been based on assumptions that no longer applied. It would have required senior officers to accept that their expertise was obsolete. It would have required Mitsubishi to abandon production lines and retool for aircraft they'd never designed. It would have required the Navy to admit that American engineering was superior. Pride killed more Japanese pilots than American guns. The Americans just pulled the triggers. The Zero was optimized to win a turning fight. The Corsair was optimized to never allow a turning fight to occur. That single strategic insight, embedded in engineering and tactical training, killed more Japanese pilots than any mechanical superiority. Sakai understood this in February 1943, after examining one captured aircraft for less than 2 days. He wrote it clearly. He documented it completely. But understanding isn't enough when institutions can't adapt. By the war's end, the Corsair had achieved an overall kill ratio of 11. 3-1 in the Pacific Theater. It destroyed 140 Japanese aircraft while losing 189 of its own. Japanese fighters never developed an effective counter-tactic because the tactical framework that guided their entire aviation culture couldn't accommodate the idea that avoiding combat was sometimes the path to victory. Okamoto died trying to follow a Corsair up because Japanese doctrine said pursuing the enemy was always correct. That doctrine killed him and thousands like him. The captured Corsair at Rabaul proved the doctrine was wrong. But proving something and changing something are different challenges entirely. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how institutions struggle to adapt even when evidence is overwhelming, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel to keep these forgotten stories alive, and drop a comment below. Do you work in an organization that struggles to change even when the data says it should? These aren't just war stories. They're lessons about human institutions that remain relevant today. Thank you for keeping Sakai's memory and the memory of pilots like Okamoto alive. They deserve to be remembered not just for how they fought, but for what their experiences taught us about the cost of institutional rigidity.